I like to begin with a thank you to all of you, our readers and our angels, for your generosity and for supporting this now sixth Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. So really, we appreciate it more than we can ever state. And it has just gotten better year after year after year for those of you who are veterans of the festival. So we thank you. Emily Yellin has done something. I'm the retired librarian here, and Emily Yellin has done something that I think is very useful. She will deny that what she has produced is a reference book, and I understand why. Because a reference book is about 4 feet thick, and in a Hollywood movie, somebody pulls it off a shelf, blows the dust off, and then it is so fact-filled that no one has ever read it or used it except maybe to arrest somebody. So and it is not that kind of reference book, but it's a lively, detailed analysis of the role of women in World War II, and it is way beyond Rosie the Riveter. And the thing that interests me the most about it is that she has explained what the various acronyms were. I mean, some of us are sort of acronym junkies, waves and wax, etc. So, Emily, how did you get started on this? And thank you for being with us, and thank you for writing this book.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I'm so honored to be here. It's been just a big pleasure. So I want to start actually telling you what happened to me this morning when I was leaving the hotel. I called the guy to drive my bags, and he came, and we got in the car, and he said, "You're a writer?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "I wrote a book about women in World War II." And he said, "Oh, my grandmother was in the French Resistance, and she was Jewish, and she escaped, and she ended up in America, and she helped the French Resistance." And so by the end of the thing, we're at the lobby of the hotel, and we're both almost in tears talking about our mother and our grandmother. And then I only had a $20 bill, and I didn't want to tip him $20. So I said, "You know what? I have an extra book. Could I give you that as a tip?" And he goes, "Oh, that would be the greatest tip." So I just want to say, books have a lot of value that you never really count on. You never really understood.
And he's speaking here this afternoon.
That's right. His grandmother was interviewed by Steven Spielberg for the Showa Project. So, I mean, I'm going to look her up. And so anyway, I just want to say I love being among people who love books. My mother was Carolyn Gilmer originally, and then she was married. She was a war bride. She was a college student. She was in graduate school when the war started, and she then moved to New York and became an editor at Reader's Digest. She was at Northwestern Journalism School when the war started, and her husband had gone to University of Minnesota Journalism School and worked at Reader's Digest. He went off to war, married her, went off to war, and she literally took his job at Reader's Digest, and so she called herself a editorial Rosie the Riveter. And so I knew all that, and he ended up, this is not my father, but it was her first husband, writing the book Mr. Roberts, which was the World War II bestseller, made into a movie with James Cagney, Henry Fonda, and Jack Lemmon. And so that was stuff I knew. She died, sadly, of breast cancer in 1999. And I got her things, many of her things, and I knew that there were these boxes, and I look, and there are shoe boxes, and they're filled with letters. My mother basically wrote letters to her parents until they died, almost every week through the 20th century, from about 1930-something to about I think the 80s. And so I have this amazing women's history of, being an American woman, and my mother was a great feminist. She was involved in all of that. So I found these letters, and I'll show you. We discussed this, and I brought visual aids in a plastic, very elegant carrier. And this is the letters. This is the envelope, right? These kind of envelopes. These are from Saipan, where in the end of the war, she decided to go and be a Red Cross girl, is what they were called. And Red Cross girls had to be 25 years old, and they had to have a college degree. And that's because of the high-level work they did serving coffee and donuts overseas. And that's what they were allowed to do. You'll hear me talk a lot about what women were allowed to do during World War II. And that's because before World War II, women weren't allowed to do a lot of things. I sort of resent that word, so I say it with, I don't usually use air quotes, but so these letters were typed. My mother took her portable typewriter on this onion skin paper, and 3 pages worth. And she had a master's degree in journalism, so they were pretty good letters. And then with this, it says opened by U.S. Army Examiner, and then it says food request last page, and then she had to sign each one of these apparently. So these are just amazing. And I think about that, and I think my grandmother kept these, and then my mother kept them, and then they ended up in my attic. And so finding that was just amazing. And there were photos of her. This is her in Saipan. And the moral of this is when everybody makes sure that the picture that survives you is when you were 25 years old. Not that she wasn't a lovely woman, but...
And you got to get your hair right.
Right,
too.
you got to get your hair right, all of that. So, but anyway, so finding that, I knew my mother very well. She was my best friend, but I got to read. I put them in chronological order, and I got to read about the war from my mother's perspective every week for 4 years in these letters. And so I got to continue my relationship with her after she died. And it was really meaningful to me. And then I thought, I'm a journalist. I could do this for everybody else as well. And so I set out and I talked to a number of women. I thought the way I was going to do this book was to talk to a lot of women who were, it was 15 years ago, so there were a lot of women still here, and I thought I would talk to them. And I did that. I went to Sun City, Arizona, and to a Rosie the Riveter's convention, and it was great. But then as I got more into it, I started reading other letters from other people. I started looking at the magazines, the women's magazines at the time, which told you to buy their products because you want to, even though you're working and doing all these things, you want to remain soft and pretty for when your husband comes home from war. So there was a lot of contradictory messages. And so I found that was so immediate. The letters and the news reports and the way women were talked about. And that forms a lot of this book. And so that's kind of how I came to it.
Well, one of your quotes in the book, and this is just a minor detour, Emily says very clearly that what these letters did in opening up her awareness was to turn the war from black and white, and we all know those black and white movies and those black and white photographs, into color.
Right, right.
It gave it the color, it gave it the vibrancy, and it gave it the reality of what our eyes see.
Yeah, I really wanted to make sure that I didn't make this about the women behind the men or the women left behind. When people say that, I kind of just go, So don't say that ever again, okay? Unless you want to see me go, again. But I really felt like it was important to look at the women in their own right, not for their relationships to men, even though those were very important and had an impact, but what does it mean to be a wife of a soldier? Not supporting him, of course, all of that, but what does it actually mean day to day? And most World War II was the first war in which married women outnumbered single women, the first time, in which married women outnumbered single women in the workforce. And think about that. They had no daycare. They had no Oprah to complain about sexual harassment. I mean, there was sexual harassment, and maybe worse. There were all sorts of things that nobody supported them, and they were pioneers. And so I often meet people, and I say, what did your mother do in the war? Oh, she didn't do anything. And then I ask further, well, she did work in a factory for a year. And yeah, I mean, my father was off at war, and I was a little bitty kid, and I had 2 brothers, and yeah, she had to go through rationing. I'm like, are you kidding? And if you've ever had to wait to hear if a loved one is not, is doing okay, and you didn't have the cell phones and you had to wait 3 weeks to hear, and maybe in those 3 weeks they're gone, you don't even know. that takes its toll. And so I really tried to look at the women with that eye instead of the eye that we actually were programmed as a country to look at them with, which is the supportive, dutiful wife and mother and girlfriend and that sort of thing. So I got past some of those images to the real people, I hope.
You mentioned in here, Emily, that 1.8 million couples were married in 1942. I'm an amateur sociologist, I think we all are. That was an astonishing number. And what you said was that, okay, the men are going off to war, and then the women would certainly go off to war as well in different ways, and even to the front lines. But that last burst of love and commitment astonished me, because one would think that, oh my God, what if he comes back with, something missing or something.
Right.
But their love and their confidence, I guess they were almost showing that through all of these 1.8 million marriages in 1942.
Well, and one of the things was the men wanted to have something to come home to. And that's kind of what the women were. My mother was one of those women. And also in 1946, she got divorced, which happened a lot. And so, it was very rushed. And I wrote a lot about, there's a church, the Little Church around the corner in Manhattan. And I can't remember the numbers, but there were tons of marriages. People were lined up at that church for war marriages because they would do it. And so again, think about that. What does that mean? And then to the wartime weddings, my favorite is some women later in the war that got married, they would come home, a man would come home and leave, and they'd get married. And supplies were short, there was rationing, so they would get married in dresses made out of parachute material from the war, that kind of thing.
There's a term that you use in here, and I don't think it's degrading, but you can help us with that, and that is camp followers. Women who went on to the front lines or close to it and ended up in camps near where there were battlefields.
Right. No, it wasn't in the combat area. It was in America.
Oh.
So they were at bases in America. And it's sort of a derogatory term, and it's all about the way women were portrayed who weren't married is really fascinating. And these are women who might have had a boyfriend who was at Fort Bragg or wherever, and then they would live nearby. Or they were single women who lived in the neighborhood area and had relationships with the guys wherever that went. And so they were kind of vilified. And really, single women at that time, if you weren't home with your father or your mother, you were vilified. And the women who joined the WACs, I'm getting a little ahead,
sure.
The Women's Army Corps, World War II was the first war in which women were allowed in the military. And I thought, well, why is that? Well, it's because in 1920, women were given the vote. So World War II is the first war in which women were allowed to vote, and it was the first war in which women were in Congress, and Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor in the cabinet. So that's why. And there was a bill at the beginning of the war, they weren't, and then the bill was passed. Edith Norse Rogers was the congresswoman who passed it. And so women were allowed in the Army, the Navy, which was the SPARS, the Coast Guard, and the Waves. And then they were also in the Air Force. And the way I say that is they were given a privilege, but it was taken away also because the women in the Army were not allowed to carry guns, and the women in the Navy, the parts of the Navy, were not allowed on ships, and the women who were in the Air Force were only allowed to fly planes in an American airspace in a war that was fought overseas. And so that's kind of the incremental way that things started to change. But imagine being those women stepping into this institution, into a war, which has really always been by men, for men, about men, and they're stepping in. And little things like their uniforms. The Army didn't know how to make uniforms for women, and then they had designers make. But a lot of women wanted to join the Navy because the uniforms were made by famous designers, so they were nicer, and so there are all sorts of stories. There's a wonderful quote which I'm not going to read, but you can read of a woman who it was the first time she wore pants, World War II. And after that, she wore pants all the time, For the women who went into the factories, it was the first time they'd had their own paycheck, even if they were married, especially if they were married. Because the other thing is, in World War II, in the Depression, 10 years earlier, women working was really frowned upon. You were taking a job from a man. And that was really frowned upon, especially during the Depression. Well, then suddenly the government realizes they need women. And so how do we do this? Well, we create fake characters. That was the first fake news, I guess. Or we create fake characters like Rosie the Riveter. She's not a real woman. And if you look at the poster, the We Can Do It, that she has on nail polish, eye makeup, mascara, lipstick, her hair is curled, and so that's what she had to look like. I don't think many men were under pressure to look pretty while they were working, and be soft and all of that. So, and then my other favorite is Betty Crocker. That Fortune magazine did a study or whatever, a survey, and they said, who is the most admired woman in America? Betty Crocker. She wasn't real. Eleanor Roosevelt was second. So it really shows the way that we create our worldview or our country's view of women, and what had to happen to change attitudes. Because a lot of the women who went into any of the services, even the Red Cross, they were thought of as sort of trying to get a husband, and they were looked down upon. And I met a lot of these women as this book came out, and I went around the country. And what I would do is I would look at them and say, thank you for your service. And do you know that some of them would almost start crying because in 60 years nobody had said that to them? And so I started to realize they were almost like Vietnam vets coming back, and they didn't talk about what they did because it was all about the men, and they needed to defer. And that's, I think, possibly why nobody had written a book in 60 years that brought all of this together. There were books about different groups of women, but I really saw this gap and tried to fill it. So I think that also makes us think about what it is to be a woman in our country and a citizen, a female citizen of the United States. And I think this was a pivotal time. I call it an inadvertent revolution because it's the time when women were, all these things opened up and they stepped in and they did what they had to do and they did it, and it changed the world. After the war, I will say one thing about after the war. They were sort of unceremoniously dumped from a lot of these positions. It was the first time women had covered war as journalists. There were so many of these things. You remember the baseball players in Tom Hanks' movie, A League of Their Own. And then they were sent back. I talked to women who were in the waves and were pilots. And then after World War II, they never flew again, went home and had children. And so we looked then at the 50s, and June Cleaver, and I wonder what she did during the war. But then you see their daughters, and my mother's an exception because she kept on being an editor, and that's a credit to my father in a lot of ways. But their daughters are doctors and lawyers, and so the way I look at it is that was when the genie was let out of the bottle. And in the 50s, we tried to put the genie back in the bottle, but it doesn't work that way. And in the 60s, I Dream of Jeannie came on. But yeah, so I really see this as a fascinating time for women. And when I look at them I keep saying this, but when I look at them in their own right and what they had to go through, and really to think about it just from that perspective. And we're not used to doing that. Even I, who was raised in a feminist household, I had to adjust my thinking, so.
I don't recall in the women's liberation movement of the 70s and that thrust of feminism that there was an appreciation for women's accomplishments in World War II. I don't think that thread was ever made.
No.
But the other part of a war, such a massive undertaking, is the domestic part I wouldn't make light of that in any single way, because these women were flying airplanes for delivery. And these women learned how to fly quickly. They learned how to fly well, reliably, safely, and deliver a very expensive product that would really help win the war. I mean, they were heroic. They may have flown from, I don't know, Van Nuys, California to Sarasota, Florida or something, but boy, they were doing the job.
Well, and they had so little support. In fact, they were sabotaged. Some of the women, there were at the places where they would touch down and get the plane gas put in the plane, and there would be mechanics, and a couple of crashes happened and women died because someone put sugar in the gas tank. Oh. And those crashes were never investigated. And then when their bodies, the women took up collections to send, because the government didn't send their bodies home. And so the women had to take up collections among themselves to send their colleague's body home to their family. And only in the 70s were the WASPs recognized and given benefits, full benefits. And they didn't get the GI Bill. They didn't get any of that. And so, as I said, it was the military was not created for women. And so these are all amazing pioneers. And I often say, so with my mother, my brothers and I had a joke that if she had been on the Titanic and it was going down, she would have turned to the passenger next to her and said, "I think dinner's going to be late tonight." Because she had such a positive attitude. It wasn't just the glass was half full. It was like, what does it matter? We've got a faucet we can keep filling the glass. And so really, I think of that song, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. And that was a World War II song, and
Absolutely.
That's what the women did. And that positive attitude, that was their armor. And I really only understood that after my mother died and I did this book. And I saw that's who she was, And I've tried to incorporate, I'm not as good at it, but I try.
And you had mentioned, Emily, that there was an African component, African-American component to this, and a Japanese-American component to that.
Yes. So what I did was I took the three kind of images we know best, and those are the first three chapters. So I have the wives, I have the Rosies, and I have Hollywood women, which is a whole other story, fascinating. And then I started looking at the women in the military and all the women in uniform service, that sort of thing. And then I looked at two groups in particular, African-American women and Japanese-American women. And the chapter on African-American women is called Jane Crow. And that's because, as you all probably know, the military was segregated in World War II, and then women were further segregated from men. So African-American women had to deal with two things. And so Jane Crow, I thought, was appropriate, and that came from a woman named Pauli Murray. Does anybody know who she is? Right. So she was an African-American woman, and in 1944, she had gone to Howard University, and she applied to Harvard Law School. And she wasn't admitted. She wasn't allowed. And it wasn't because she was African-American, it was because she was a woman. And so she went to Howard Law School, finished first in her class, and ended up being the first African-American woman to get a PhD in law from Yale in '63 or something. And she went on, and she was the founder of the National Organization for Women. She was an amazing feminist. She's a really fascinating woman. And that she organized sit-ins in the 40s. So she, way before Rosa Parks, and I mean, not way, but 10 years before. And then there's Lena Horne, which is one of my not favorite stories. She was performing for the USO, and she had in her contract at that time that she would not play a maid. She would not play those kinds of characters. And she went to perform in, I believe it was Fort Riley, Kansas, at the base. And they told her, yes, you'll be performing in the auditorium at night, and tomorrow morning you'll do a performance in the mess hall for the African-American soldiers because they're not allowed in the auditorium on our base. And so she did it, and she said, one of the problems with segregation, it was so inconvenient, And she said, so she woke up in the morning, 8 in the morning in the mess hall, and she peeked out at the, to see before the show, and she looks, and in the first 3 rows, she saw the black soldiers, but in the first 3 rows are white soldiers. And she said, who's that? And they said, oh, that's the German POWs.
Whoa.
So the German POWs were seated in front of the American black soldiers. And she said, no, not going to do it. And she walked out and she marched over to the local NAACP office and met Daisy Bates, who ended up being in the Little Rock integration. She was the head of, she led that. And so she then quit the USO, and she had enough money that she did her own tours. And she would perform for all the soldiers, and she demanded that. And so, these are little ways in which women can use their power, and I think it's just fascinating. And I really feel that a lot of social change happens in little ways, wearing pants, little things. We think of it as epic, and World War II is always told in these epic terms. But if you put it all together, it's pretty epic when you look at the women's story. And then for
the Japanese,
yeah. So I talked to a woman who, her family, she was in her early 20s, and she had sisters, and her family had been in San Francisco, part of San Francisco, and they had a floral shop, her parents. And her parents had come over from Japan, and she was first-generation American. And they had to go to the internment camps. And can I read?
Oh,
Want to read a little thing, if I can. I think I remember where it is. I just want to read what she wrote, because I can't even say it to you in the way that she did. Akiko Mabuchi Toba said that years later, people still wondered why her generation, and the women in particular, appeared so passive in the face of internment. She said it was important for everyone to understand they were not being complacent at the time. Instead, they believed they were displaying a steely kind of defiance. It was their sole option in those times, given the racial climate of the country and what had been ingrained in them by their Issei parents, the immigrants. And this is her. Our generation was raised never to call attention to ourselves, to work twice as hard as others, and above all, never to bring shame to the family. We had a strict upbringing, and women in particular were never to cause any waves in society. I think it was because our parents were having enough trouble at the time making their way in America and showing their loyalty, and they didn't want us to make it harder. So when the war broke out, the only thing we felt we could do was go behind that barbed wire to prove we were loyal. I lost 3 years of my life, and my parents lost everything they had built up over the years. But I sure hope we proved it.
Wow.
Right?
Ooh.
So a lot of their brothers or sons were in the military, and there was a Japanese American unit. There were a couple of them, and they proved, they were amazing. I don't have all the statistics, but look that up too. And imagine you're in basically a concentration camp, and your brother is fighting for the country that's putting you in prison. So there were a lot of contradictions. It's a good fight, and we were fighting the Nazis and all that. And we were fighting fascism. But for African Americans, for Japanese Americans, there was a real double bind there. So that's another really fascinating part of this.
And I think the risks that women took, and as you said, certainly unarmed, going to the front. I mean, this is not as sexist as it sounds, but delivering donuts, baking donuts, making coffee, and delivering it to the front lines to boost morale.
Right.
But my God, I wouldn't do that job.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
I mean, that was when I realized that my mother, every woman who has ever served in the military, the Red Cross, has volunteered. Every woman, okay? They haven't been drafted. Every single woman. We talk about volunteering. Well, think about that, okay? And to think that my mother at 24, 25 went to war, chose to go to war. She had an older sister, so my grandfather and grandmother didn't have a son to send. And so my mother went, And just to think about what that meant. And the Red Cross, the USO, were two of the groups of women who were closest to the front lines. And my mother used to tell me about how when they would have to go to the bathroom in Saipan, they'd have to have an escort to take them to the bathroom. And she also had a story about driving. They had a driver, and they were going out to the pilots and the men who made the airplanes and service them, mechanics, I guess, and to give them coffee and donuts. And I have these jewels, basically. They made bracelets, they made hair combs out of tin from the airplanes, and then they would put a jewel on it that was a bullet, and then they would do this thing where they would punch it and would have these, it was very beautiful. And my mother had all these bracelets, and I used to wear them when I was a kid, and they were made from World War II planes. And Saipan, Tinian is where the Enola Gay was launched, and I believe, I'm not sure my geography, but I think it flew over my mother. So that's a pretty dangerous place to be, right? Under the Enola Gay. Wow. So, I mean, those women aren't thought of as being a part of the combat. But, as we all know, women are often doing things that their job title doesn't quite describe their responsibilities. And so it's a pretty, the other thing is, there were 75 men to one woman when my mother went. Earlier, it was worse. So she has a line in here where in one of her letters where she said, "You had to keep it constantly in mind, otherwise you thought you were pretty amazing." And there's these pictures of her where she has on her wedding ring, because she was married, and there's like 10 men around her, and she's,
We have Lynn Olsen with us this morning, and Lynn was great yesterday morning talking about the Citizens of London, her book, Citizens of London. And that book is really framed, I think, by courage. I hope that's fair to say. Really, the way that people step up in these seemingly impossible situations. I mean, look at how cushy this is. I don't think anybody's in too much danger here. But when you think of when a war breaks out, war is created by governments against other governments, and people step up and get so deeply embedded they may be killed, or they may just show that courage.
Right.
And I think what your book is really about, to me, is, oh boy, the courage was really expansive, deep, and complete in this society.
Yeah.
And women, well, you're doing it, and talk about not getting their due.
Well,
there's a lot of courage in this book.
Right. The other thing I want to say, though, is the last couple of chapters, I write about some less savory women.
That's okay.
No, and one to mention is just, there were traitors to America. There were some anti-Semitic women who were part of, and it was called America First. People don't remember that was actually anti-Semitism during World War II in America. And they sent out these horrible, the women organized it, and they sent out horrible notices about not supporting this war because, it was helping the Jews, that kind of thing. And then there was, in Hawaii, the U.S. government and the Hawaiian government, state government, ran a brothel, and there would be sometimes they shipped in sex workers from San Francisco, and the men would line up during the day, and they were tested for VD and diseases, because in World War I, more men were killed by STDs than by bullets. And so they thought, well, let's just set this up and we'll have clean American women in Hawaii, because that's where everybody went through in the Pacific Theater. And the women you pay $3 for 3 minutes. And the women would see 100 men a day. And if you, again, think about it from their perspective and what that was.
God.
And they didn't last long, but they made more money than almost any women in America at that time, but, it was quite a cost. So it's a really interesting time.
Indeed. Now, we have a very smart audience here, our readers and our angels. Why don't we try a little Q&A? Are you okay with that?
I'm open to it. I want to end with a little thing from my mother, if I may, just because this is my little pet thing, and we've got... Well, I'll get you to 10 minutes. How about that?
That's perfect.
So my mother, when I finished this book, I really wanted to kind of say, talk to my mother, but she was gone. And I found an audio tape of a speech she gave in 1971. I'm from Memphis, to a Memphis church group. And I often say a Memphis church group to make people feel comfortable, but it was a Unitarian church, and it was the people who the Unitarian church was too conservative for them. So they started their own Unitarian group that was more liberal. So But it was on women's liberation, and she titled it "The Humanization of Emily: Thoughts on My Daughter and Women's Liberation." And I was 9 years old, and apparently I was in the audience. I do not remember this, but I think I might have learned something that day. It's a whole speech about how women's work is never done and how women's stories are really only family stories, because women's stories were not recorded just like African Americans, because we weren't the ones writing the history. So I almost think just writing this book was an act of revolution, right? And so she talks about that. She goes on and she tells about my own great-grandmother, her grandmother, and how they don't talk about the building of the West, but she stopped a prairie fire. Her husband was off, and she stopped a prairie fire that was threatening her family. She and another woman next door put it out. And they don't talk about that when we talk about building the West, right? And so she talked about that, and then she ended her speech, and I will just read how I wrote it and read you what she said. She said, this is me, but it was the anecdote my mother used to end her speech that gave me the almost spooky sense that I might have been destined to write this book all along. It was as if, whether or not I knew it, invisible forces were pushing me to expand my thinking and take a long, serious look at the women's point of view during World War II. That day, when I was 9, my mother, the former Red Cross girl, told a story that summed up the mission in my quest, even though it would be some 30 years before I realized it. And this is what she said. This is my mother. She said, "I was driving the carpool, as I often do. This is one part of women's work I would not give up. And in the back seat, Emily and some of her friends were chattering. And I was thinking of the grocery list, as I do between other tasks, and suddenly I heard some very interesting talk going on. This was several weeks ago. I heard them saying, 'Daughter of a first aid kit, daughter of a first aid kit.' And I said, 'Emily, what's that?' And Emily said, 'Well, we play Land of Opposites at school, and there's this boy there who keeps saying, son of a gun, son of a gun. So we just say, daughter of a first aid kit.'"
Right.
And then my mother says, "Well, I thought, here is the descendant of all the women in my family, the ongoing continuum. Here is this young female person. Maybe she will get the chance. Maybe she will know a day when the daughter of a first aid kit will be as valued in our society and our culture as the son of a gun."
Beautiful. Wow. Woo. Well, I think that was very revealing, Emily.
I had a sense of humor even back then. I had 3 older brothers, so I knew how to talk back to guys. So.
Do we have any questions for Emily? I'm sure we do.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
So the Red Cross girls in later wars were donut dollies. But of course the coffee and the donuts were just an excuse to talk to a smart, pretty American girl.
Yes, but they set up, they also set up these clubs, though, and that was very important. And, these are these college-educated women, and when I read my mother's letters about how they're setting up the club and all, the intensity with which they did that, and it's true that they were serving coffee and donuts, and you're right, they were there to be American women overseas, but I also think they were really psychologists, they were therapists, they were all sorts of things. So it's an amazing, again, I can't get over that they had to have a college degree.
Well, what do you think? What would that be, a class? Is that a class thing? In other words, that they wanted these young women to be of a certain class level so that they wouldn't be hanging out with the soldiers and being naughty?
Probably, but I went to college and when I was 25. But yes,
No, but
they were white. They were white.
But very few women had college degrees.
Right, exactly.
You're talking
Not
about
that many women.
What would be the college-equipped 10% of the American population? 12, maybe?
And a lot of colleges
American
were all
women?
women, and that's who went there. But yeah, it's definitely
very
that.
low
My
number.
mother tells a story in her letters about driving past a group of black soldiers, and they asked the driver, who was Native American, to stop because they wanted to serve them. And he said, no, you can't stop, you'll be raped. And my mother and this other woman said, no, we're stopping. And they went, and they served coffee and donuts to black soldiers. And she said in her letter that they were shocked because they had never been waited on by anybody. And here are these white women, and that's my mother, who then was later involved in the civil rights movement. So. Yeah.
You might want to repeat the question.
Yes, go ahead.
No, I mean...
I will. Have any of the women in the military been recognized decades later with a medal or something? There are women who won Purple Hearts. One of them was a Red Cross girl, I keep saying that, who was in France and she was killed. And there are other, as I mentioned, the WASPs, there was a big ceremony, and I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was in the 70s, and they were brought to Washington and celebrated, and they were given the things they should have been given in 1946, you know, the privileges and military benefits and that sort of thing. And there have been books about specific women, so there is some, maybe not sufficient.
Other questions?
The question was, were the sex trade workers who were brought in made a lot of money? Did the government take some of that? I actually don't know that. That's a really good question. And I might have actually researched it. I wrote this book 15 years ago, so it might be in the book, but I don't think I actually asked that question. So I do know, though, they weren't allowed to go to anywhere else in Honolulu. They couldn't go to the beach. They had this one area. There's the Mamie Stover, I think is the book. It was a movie also, and she was a madam, and it's a sort of fictional account. But I also found some documents where in Hawaii, I didn't unfortunately get to go to Hawaii, they just sent them to me, but that document some of this. So I can talk to you later too, because I think that's an interesting question.
Did you find anyone else that had letters like your mother had written?
So the question is, did I find any other letters besides my mother's? Yes. I searched. There are archives where they have kept women in war. There's one in North Carolina, in Greensboro, North Carolina, about women in war, and they've kept a lot of letters from all the wars. And if anybody has letters in their attic, please don't throw them away. Don't let your brothers near them. That's the key, because if they want to throw them away, and I didn't let them. But yeah, so I mean, that's really what I found was so useful. And there were 2 books done that brought together letters of women. The thing about the letters of the women is that they're not, they were sent to the men. So there's lots of letters from men that women kept, but the letters from the women that were sent to their husbands have not survived. The letters like my mother, who wrote home to her parents, that's some of what you had. So yeah, it's really tricky.
There's a fabulous World War II museum in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been there? And do they make any mention of women during the war?
Well, it's funny you should ask. She said the World War II museum, is there any mention of women? Okay. Funny you should ask. My brother produced the film that starts the World War II museum in New Orleans. And he used a quote from our mother, and he got his pick. He actually worked with Tom Hanks, and he got his pick of who would read it. Jennifer Garner reads my mother's words, and it comes up and it has her picture. So yes, there are women mentioned, and I have not been there, but I hope to go. How about that? Did Doug Brinkley hear that? Oh.
I'm Lynn Olsen. I am a consultant to the World War II Museum, and they're making really, really active, they're trying very, very hard to include more women. They realize that has been a missing part of they're really...
Well, we'll talk then. I'll help them. Thank you. Thank you. About the women, yeah.
The Air Museum, Palm Springs Air Museum? Oh, the Jackie Cochran?
Yeah, Jackie Cochran, yes. She was she was the head of the WASPs. Yeah. Right. Yeah, we're saying there are naval museums. There's also a Rosie the Riveter's Museum in Richmond, California, and I was there at the opening of that, and some of the women were there. Yeah, it was great, and that was a plant during World War II where women worked, and so there's starting to be. Yes, go ahead, and then you. I think that's all.
Yeah, that's
we've
fine.
got 40 seconds.
I'm just checking, and I thought it was a wee bit later that other awards came, and Obama, President Obama, gives the first female pilots
Oh, good.
Congressional Medal of Honor,
Yes.
and it was July 1st, 2009.
Okay. July 1st, 2009, the Congressional Medal of Honor to the pilots. Yes.
The gold one.
Go ahead. The last question, you and yeah.
I'm a Canadian, and I have the letters home of my uncle from First World War that were sent to my grandmother. And when you mentioned hanging on to the letters, in Canada we have a federal veterans organization that is collecting all these letters.
Right.
Is there anything?
Yes. So she said in Canada they're collecting letters. There was a veterans project. I think it was the Library of Congress. I could be wrong, but somewhere in their government that was collecting veteran stories, and they were really careful to collect women's as well. So yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't think they got letters though. So
Thank you, Emily. You've
thank
done
you
a great
all
service.
so much. Thank you.